Who is Moses? Sound fun?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right.
Mo-
I hope you enjoy it. Moshe.
Moshe.
Mushy, mushy, mushy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Japanese, if you please. All right. Yeah. So, when it comes to this person, Moses, this guy, right? This guy, Moses. All right. So, what do we really know about him? What's a great way when it comes to establishing somebody's actual presence in history is, well, first and foremost, physical remains. Is there a tomb? Is there a coffin? Is there any kind of established place of burial? Any remains? And when you open it, is there a body inside? And can you establish the remains? Right? And sometimes that can conflict with history books. History books can say somebody's located here and they weren't there. There is King Richard III of England, who is reported by a historical text that says he died in 1485 BC during the Battle of Bosworth Field. Supposedly, he was supposed to be buried near a small church nearby. He was never found. So, wherever he was supposed to be located was lost in the histories until 2012, when he was found buried under a parking lot. They did radiocarbon testing, DNA testing, and different things, and found out this, in fact, is the King Richard III of England. So, we have his physical remains.
Wow.
But what if you don't have that? Because in the case of Moses, is there a physical body somewhere? No, not at all. In fact, there's actual story later on in the New Testament, I believe it's Jude, that goes later on and talks about, which is millenniums later, that talk about this dispute where two beings are fighting over the remains of the body, whether or not it was supposed to be buried somewhere or whether or not it was taken somewhere else. It just says there is dispute over this body. So it's a nice, clean way of saying, hey, there's no body, forget about it. Yeah, exactly. There's no body, I don't know, forget it, Paulie, I don't know, forget about it. You know? Who's asking questions? No? Yeah. Are there other ways of knowing when it comes to physical remains? Well, maybe archaeological records, right? You have Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great was never found. There's no tomb. There's no place for his body. There's no any of that. But we have several different pieces of history when it comes to this guy. He was supposed to have died in 323 BC, but we have tons of statues with his effigy, with his image on it, that were created, even copies of him that were made during the same time that he was still alive. All right, we have coins. There are coins with the same picture of him that date back to the time of his existence. So we have money, currency, with his picture on it. All right, so there's that. We have, if you go to the Temple of Athena in Greece, you'll see an inscription where he goes up and he's like, hey, King Alexander was here. No, I'm just kidding. It says, King Alexander dedicates this to Athenia Polias. All right, inside of the Temple of Athena. So he made an inscription when he went there in his journey there. There's also external sources. There's a text that's made in Babylonian cuneiform that actually describes the victory of Alexander the Great over the Persian king Darius III. So we do have other sources, though we don't have a body. We do have sources that he existed. Okay, does that apply to Moses? No, because we don't have any of those that kind of stuff with Moses either. So Moses' existence would fall mainly in line with textual sources. Now, when it comes to textual sources, that could be a little bit of a toughie because a lot of historical texts are in conflict with one another. So how do you determine which is real? Do you just read them all and you kind of just figure out whatever you want on your own? Well, I guess that's one way of approaching it, but scientists actually created what's called the historical method. Now that's what I'm going to go over in applying to this person called Moses. Say, what do we really know about this person, Moses? Okay, using the historical method. And the historical method is one, archaeological records. If a king says that he had 1 million soldiers near his palace, is there archaeological records that can suggest that he could actually support that many soldiers there or even in his local towns nearby? Is there enough water, enough food supply, enough sources? I mean, is there an archaeological footprint to suggest that many people? What can we do to determine? Or maybe it was close to 50 or 100,000. They just wanted to make it seem better. You got to remember, in the age that I'm talking about, in these ages, there was no internet. There was no video camera, there was no cell phones, there was no newspapers. The way that you spread propaganda was typically from messengers and writings. And sometimes there was a lot of political pressure from kings upon different historians and whatnot to actually include things that are more favorable or embellished. So you have, archaeological resources. Does it line up with that too? Multiple sources. Are there multiple sources, and can we gain a confluence from them? Some kind of general theme of what's going on. If you have 10 sources that say that the Grecians defeated the Persians in a particular war, but you have one writing that says that the Persians defeated the Grecians, you might want to give more weight to that which has more multiple sources behind it, right?
Right.
Yeah, seems fair. And then there's bias. Number 3, bias. Are the sources biased? Okay, because again, I said, a lot of kings like to boast when they conquered somebody else, and they got this and they got that and they did this. They wanted to make it bigger than what it was. So there's often biases behind who was actually writing it sometimes. You have to weigh that. Now, number 4, time. How much time since the event did the writing about it appear? If you have an event that happened and then 20 years later a manuscript or a writing text appears about it, that might be a little bit more accurate than, let's say, if it appeared 200, 300, 400 years after the fact. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. So that'd be closer to the event, not the game of telephone. And I don't mean one that could have been created at that time but then wasn't discovered till a lot time later, but it was dated back to that time. That's not what I mean. I mean more as like the actual original source referring to that event actually appearing. If it happened way later, you might want to give less weight to it to maybe something that appeared sooner. Or at least evaluate it in the weight that you give it. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Cool. Then you have genre. What genre of the text are you reading? And this is a big one, because this is actually going to really help how we evaluate a lot of different texts. See, modern historians write in linear fashion, chronological, dates, times, charts, facts, all that kind of stuff. In the genre that they write in is what's called as nonfiction. But that is not how ancient historians wrote. Yes, there might be dates. Yes, there might be times and facts and names and stuff. But really, oftentimes they wrote that with forms of embellishment and even sometimes literary devices of what is known common to the culture to create an overall craft of a theme of what they're trying to communicate. It's the big picture of what they're trying to say, not necessarily all the little tiny points. That's the way we think nowadays. Fact-checking, grammar, everything is really structured a lot with historians nowadays, but that's not necessarily how the ancient historians wrote. Okay? What you'll want to do in figuring out, giving weight to something that's a historical writing, is determining how much literary tropes are involved inside of the writing. Sure. Because then that can tell you whether or not you're reading more nonfiction or are you actually reading a story. So now, applying that to Moses, first I'm going to give a little backdrop on Moses. He lived somewhere between about 1500 to about 1200 BC. Okay? The exact timing is depending upon your interpretation of the archaeological data. And oftentimes those things are in conflict with each other. So the best we can do is paint a rough picture as about 15 to 1200 BC, right? If you want to be more honest about it. Backdrop with him, he was born at a time where his people, the Israelites, well, they weren't Israelites yet, Hebrews, were born into slavery, or they were slaves. He gets placed into a basket, baby Momo, bye-bye on the river, put in a basket on the river. One of Pharaoh's daughters gets him, brings him to the palace where he's raised. He then grows up, commits murder, has to take off and book it. Right? Because, the bail bonds or whatever. Right? So he has to book it. And he books it over to Midian, right? Where there he gets a burning bush experience, and God is telling him he needs to go back and free his people. And he goes back. And first of all, when he asks him, who shall I say sent me, he says Ea, or Ie. Ea asher Ie. It's another thing I'll get into at a later time, but for now, I'll just say, I am sent me. So he goes back, and through a series of plagues, takes his people out of Egypt, through the parting of the Red Sea, Sinai Peninsula, all the way into Canaan, where it gets 10 commandments, and they wander around 40 years until most of that generation actually died.
Oh my gosh.
Except for 2 of that generation. And then you have him finally at the ending place dying off and doesn't get to cross into the promised land. So then his captain, his general, his commander, Joshua, then takes it from there and takes the people into now military conquest to displace the natives of that land who are known as Canaanites, and to bring in what they called their promised land from their God. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a brief little kind of synopsis about that. Now, interesting thing is archaeological record. Is there any support for this at all? Well, the Bible says that there was over 600,000 male slaves that Moses took from Egypt to the Promised Land, or close to it, right? Well, here's the thing, is he didn't just free male slaves. He freed all of the Hebrews, supposedly. Well, women and children included, that would take up the number to somewhere close to 2 million people. Okay, so close to 2 million people are now leaving and departing Egypt. Is there any record, archaeologically wise, for a sudden drop in population in Egypt by 2 million people? Boom. No, there is not. Is there any evidence of 2 million people crossing over through the Red Sea in the Sinai Peninsula? No, there is not. Is there any evidence of a sudden shift in population where 2 million people arrived into Canaan, and also the displacement of the Canaanites that were there? No, there's not. Now, even if you looked at it and says, okay, maybe Egypt was trying to cover up their tracks. They didn't want anybody to find out that they got royally handed to them, and they were embarrassed about it or whatever, so they want to try to cover it up. You can't cover up an archaeological footprint of 2 million people traveling around. You just can't. I mean, there'd be litter and stuff, you know.
McDonald's wrappers.
Yeah, McDonald's wrappers, you know, barbecue, you know, when they stop and stuff, whatever. So you have all those points. Now, does that mean, because there's no archaeological evidence for Moses to have done this, does this mean that Moses didn't exist? No, it does not. Does this mean that there was no Exodus? No, it does not. It just means that it wasn't with 2 million people. Okay? Now, the Hebrew scholar Richard Friedman says in his book, The Exodus, he brings up an interesting point. He says that out of all the tribes of Israel, it was only the ones that came out of Levi were the ones that end up, some of them, with Egyptian names. Isn't that interesting? Like Hophni, Hur, Phineas, Merari, Pashur, and the most popular one, Moses, which is an Egyptian name. So he claims that there's a possibility that out of all the tribes of Israel, only the tribe of Levi came from Egypt, because they were the ones that ended up as their priesthood, and a lot of them had Egyptian names. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So, with all that being said, Moses is associated with a place called Midian. And Midian was home to a people called the Shasu. How many people have heard of the Shasu? Not many, right? Which is interesting, because the Shasu had a god that they worshipped, which is very close to the name that the Israelites would end up worshiping. Yahoo. Yeah, interesting? Yahweh. Very similar. And that's where Moses was. So he may have actually been either a Midianite or even a member of the Shasu, and was now becoming famous because he was now taking the name of their God to the Israelites and introducing them to Hashem, or Yahweh. Right?
Wow.
Isn't that cool? Mm-hmm. Now, we did archaeological, and there's none. When it comes to multiple sources, is there multiple sources that actually talk about Moses? Yes. Lots of different sources about Moses. So now we just want to find some confluence. Okay, in some of the Hellenistic records, Moses is known for like creating a building, or he's known for making a temple, but inside of Egypt, not Israel. He's also claimed to have made the alphabet with the help of a person named Thoth. Or he's known for introducing the concept to Egypt of written law. Or he's known, like the Roman historian Tacitus says, that he didn't leave Egypt to go colonize Canaan, but when he did go, it only took him 6 days and he arrived on the 7th. There was no 40 years, according to the Roman historian Tacitus. Now, one of the interesting stories is there's an Egyptian priest and historian named Manetho. And Manetho existed during the Ptolemaic period, and he talks about an Asiatic group of people that lived in the southern area of Egypt that occupied and ruled over it for probably like 100 years, named the Hyksos. And the Hyksos, probably reigned there from what he claims, about 100 years before they got booted out to Canaan. Well, he tells this Manetho tells a story of an Egyptian priest named Osarseph. So think Osar like Osiris, but O-S-A-R, and then Seph like Joseph, right? Osarseph. Osarseph was now alive at the time the end of the Hyksos period of their time in Egypt. Now he tells a story that Egyptians had enslaved some lepers. And he rallied them together as well as the Hyksos and gathered them together to actually form an army to get rid of the Pharaoh, which they succeeded in doing for 13 years. And during this 13 years, he rules over Egypt, and he starts, wrecking all the other temples except his own, until he was booted out by the Pharaoh returning. And after which he's booted out, he changes his name. Guess what he changes his name to? Moses. Isn't that interesting? So here's this guy, Osarseph becomes Moses. Conquers 13 years. Now, there's some confluence here between this story and the story of Moses, but also great differences between the two. But what they both have in common is that they parallel a time in history of a very established historical figure and ruler, Pharaoh, in Egypt named Akhenaten. Okay? Now Akhenaten, I won't go to a ton of stuff about him right now, because I want to keep it more about Moses. But anyhow, one of the things that parallel to them is that this person Akhenaten, amongst all the gods in Egypt, he was actually one who introduced a form of monotheism to the Egyptians. And Moses was doing the same thing to the children of Israel. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Okay? So they both introduced monotheism around the same time. That's pretty interesting, right? Bottom line is, when it comes to this particular point of the multiple sources, is that there is a lot of different stories about Moses. But almost none of them agree with each other. So we don't really have confluence there. So how do we evaluate this and weight? Well, you look at bias. Is any of these texts biased? I'd have to say yes. Because the Bible, what text do we have? The Bible, well, that's written from Moses, supposedly, by Moses, about Moses. So then, can't really say that's not biased, because that's there to create a perspective of a religious worldview. Yeah. And non-biased sources, and this is a toughie, and this is what I don't always hear a lot from different scholars, is that during the Hellenistic period, there was a lot of anti-Jewish propaganda in a lot of different writings. And they were also known to actually take certain stories that the Jews were saying and spin it. So to have somebody who take a political twist to a Jewish story about the Moses character is not out of the question. So can I fully say that these non-Jewish sources are not biased either? I can't really say that. So I just, in academic honesty, I just evaluate, I just take that for what it is, right? I don't think any exist. But it's interesting when it comes to looking at the multiple sources part of things, is there are many, none of them agree. The only thing that is really agreed upon by all of them is that Moses is like a renegade leader who has like bold ideas. All right, that's about it. Everything else is not really agreed upon. So time. How long did it take for the first appearance or Moses' death before his name is actually mentioned out in textual sources? Well, Al-Muqaddimah, in his work, I think you can even find his video, he talks about Muhammad. When he died, the amount of years that it took from Muhammad's death to his appearance in a non-Islamic source was 8 years. Now, I've heard different things when it comes to Jesus, one of which you can look at, let's talk about religion. They were talking about how the first time that Jesus' name appears in a non-Christian source, after his death, resurrection notwithstanding, was 63 years. Moses, entirely different story. Moses, from the time of his death to the time that he's named in a non-Jewish source is over 1,000 years. A millennium. And even in an actual Jewish source, the time in which his death occurred from the beginning stages of the formation of the Torah is 750 years. That's a long time before his name is actually brought up. So do you see that may not always be the greatest source, especially when how many generations of telephone have happened, right? Does this mean that Moses didn't exist? No. Does this mean there was an exodus of some sort? No. It just means it's not how it's been put.
Right.
Okay. Now, what we do know is this. From the first 4 that I've released is what? Archaeological record, there is none. Multiple sources, they all conflict with one another. Is there any bias? Absolute bias. All the way across the board, likely. And the time was many, 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 many centuries after the fact. Which leads me up to point number 5. And point number 5 is genre. Genre. What genre was this book written in? Okay, because again, historians did not write in the same way. They were known for taking date, facts, time, certain things like that, and then mixing embellishments and stories and some cultural stuff. And I remember I said, if you find the text that you're looking at historically full of literary tropes, then you might have to evaluate what you're reading is likely a story, right? Okay, well, starting out as a peasant and then ending up in a palace is a literary trope from that time. That's one of them. Getting placed into a basket and being put on a river and then drawn out. Well, one of the earliest sources for that dates way before the Torah, and talks about Sargon the Great, Sargon of Akkadian, who was noted for being one of the first major rulers there, the Akkadians.
Yeah.
And that he existed a millennium before Moses.
Yeah.
The first emperor, right? There's a little bit of debate about that, but it's widely believed that he was the first emperor. And he was a millennium before Moses. Mm-hmm. So that story has already been said, already been told.
Right.
You get it? Having to run away. Being on the run, and then later on coming back to your homeland and fulfilling some great feat and some great amazing thing in your life. Like, how he went on the run for murder and then came back, right? Okay, that running away and then having to come back to your homeland, that is also a famous historical form of literature at the time. Let's see, what's another one? For prince or a princess to come out of their palace to actually see what the common folk and how hard they have to work, how hard their labor is, that's part of ancient folk hero story. The parting of the Red Sea. Parting of the Red Sea. It's also part of famous hero stories. In fact, the crossing of a body of water was actually almost like a form of baptism. It's where you left your old life behind and you started a new life. So those are all literary tropes. So the Moses story is full of them, all over the place. So given that we have that and all the things that I presented, does this mean that Moses didn't exist? No, it just means that he's more likely that of a legendary figure than a literal one. And with that, we have to be honest and actually take into account there is actually no historical record, archaeological record, all that kind of stuff. But there are many textual things that talk about him, but there's just not confluence over them, and there's not likely any unbiased source behind it. And we definitely have aspects of time, a length, like millennium of time before he's even mentioned. That make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the genre is very much story form. So that being said, I just wanted to put that stuff together. What you guys do with it, or what anybody who listens to it do with it, I hope you appreciate the gathering of information here.
Yes.
I just wanted to present that, and there's going to be more coming into about that because we have more to share about that. But it was some of the findings that I had, and some of the things that I had been thinking about for quite some time, and I really hope that you guys appreciate it. But that's my conclusion when it comes to Moses.
That's awesome.
Yeah.